Introduction to Ethics, Chapter 2. The objective of this chapter is to introduce students to one of the broadest and most important group of theories in philosophical morality. Consequentialist theories raise challenging questions about the role, use, and function of consequences in moral reasoning and in living the moral life. It asks the question, should we only consider the consequences of our actions? Should we consider consequences only for ourselves? What about others? And then which others? Now, each question leads to more questions, which is philosophy and ethics in a nutshell. Should we, for instance, consider short-term consequences, or are long-term more important? This range of questions can be extended almost indefinitely. Two major viewpoints. Ethics divides into two major viewpoints at this point. Consequentialism, which is what we're going to discuss right now, and non-consequentialism. This chapter is primarily concerned with the first viewpoint. Consequentialist morality is also called teleological. Break that word down. Teleological. It's a Greek compound word, and from it we get the word telescope, or viewing something far off, close. Teleological. Looking at consequences. Morality in consequentialist viewpoint is based or concerned with consequences. Imagine that. Non-consequentialist morality is also called deontological, fancy word that just means duty-based. And it says that morality is not based on or concerned with consequences. So it's fairly simplistic. You're either concerned with consequences or you're not. For this morning's lecture, that's what we're looking at, is consequentialist morality. Now, you can further break consequentialist morality into two major divisions. One is ethical egoism, and the second is utilitarianism. Both theories agree that human beings ought to behave in ways that will bring about good consequences. Now, they disagree on who should benefit from these consequences. Ethical egoism says act in self-interest, and utilitarianism says act for the interests of all. I used to wear a Spock outfit when I'd give this lecture. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And that is utilitarianism. I could go get a Spock costume now, but I just don't think that most people today even know who Spock is. But think about that. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. That is straight on utilitarian philosophy. First, we're going to start with the egoism, and we're going to start with psychological egoism. Psychological egoism is not an ethical theory per se, because it is descriptive or scientific theory having to do with egoism. Ethical egoism, on the other hand, is a normative theory. Uh, Psychological ethical egoism, or PE, has two forms, strong and weak. The strong says always, and the weak says often, but not always. Strong form, people always act in their own self-interest. The weaker form, people often, but not always, act in their own self-interest. Now, we'll discuss this further. I want you to think about it, though. Do people usually act in their own self-interest? Now, there's some problems. Every time we discuss any of these theories, we're going to be looking at problems with the theories as well. Now, in its strong form, the one that says people will always, or I will always act in my own self-interest, it doesn't refute morality. In its weaker form, it does not provide a rational foundation for ethical egoism. Think about this. What about circumstances in which people do unselfish things even though they don't want to do them. What comes to mind is the soldier or Marine that throws himself on a grenade. What's he get out of it? People would argue that acts of charity. Now, if you are an egoist, you'd say, well, look, you only commit an act of charity because it makes you feel good. So you get something out of it. But I would say that doesn't hold up, because when the guy throws himself on a grenade, he's not thinking about anyone else, or excuse me, he's not thinking about himself. He's only thinking about everyone else. And so it doesn't really hold up very well. Ethical egoism is a philosophical, normative, prescriptive theory. It has three forms: the individual, the personal, and the universal. The individual says, everyone ought to act in my self-interest. That'd be great, wouldn't it? The personal form: I ought to act in my own self-interest, but make no claims on what others should do. That's probably more realistic. And then the universal form: everyone should always act in his or her self-interest. There's some truth to the idea that we are selfish, basically, because we usually do ask the question, what's in it for me? Even when we act for somebody else, excuse me, I'm trying to get used to this camera, we are asking that question of ourselves. What's in it for me? Now, there are some problems, especially with the universal form. Universal ethical egoism is the theory most commonly presented, but still has some problems. The big one is inconsistency. It's unclear whose self-interest should be satisfied. You obviously are worried about your self-interest. I'm worried about my self-interest, so we have a conflict here. Which one should be satisfied? Yours, mine, theirs, the dog's, whose? Um, uh, then you have the question, what is meant by everyone? The term everyone is vague. It's ambiguous. Everyone's interests create conflicts and more inconsistencies. Then there's the problem of giving moral advice. It's difficult to determine how to give moral advice because, well, first of all, usually advice is difficult at any rate. It's hard to give good advice. But here, how do you give moral advice when I'm saying that you should always act in my best interest? It's like we're playing a game of poker, and you show me your hand and say, what should I do? And I look at my hand, and I see that your hand beats mine, so I tell you, well, just fold. It works for me, but is that in your best interests? Problems continued. Blurring the moral and non-moral uses of ought and should. Supporters of egoism tend to blur the moral and non-moral uses of ought and should. This makes universal egoism highly impractical at best, and at worst, again, more conflicts, more inconsistencies. This is a problem with many of the systems we're going to look at, is conflicts. What do we do when our interests conflict? And many of these uh, ideas, many of these systems don't give us a clear answer. Um, More problems. It's inconsistent, especially with helping professions. Many of you in this class are in nursing school, and egoism simply doesn't work with the helping professions. Ethical egoism in any form does not provide the proper ethical basis for helping people. Um, some people in the helping professions do so out of self-interest. I would say uh, all of us do. I mean, I'm a nurse as well, and would I do it for free? The answer is probably not. I can't afford to give my time away. I do like to volunteer, but by and large, do we act out of self-interest? To a point, we do, but would we continue to do this job if it wasn't a caring profession? Um, Many nurses and many healthcare professionals and many in the caring professions love to help others. A highly self-interested attitude would not serve one well in a helping profession. There are some advantages as well as some problems. One, it's easier to determine self-interest. Um, that goes without saying. I mean, if everything should be done for me, it's easy for individuals to determine what your own interests are. Obviously, hopefully, you know what that is. It encourages individual freedom and responsibility. It works when people operate in limited spheres, isolated from one another, which minimizes conflict. In other words, you're telecommuting, you're working from your office, kind of like I'm doing here. It works well there. But when you are in constant contact with someone, it doesn't work nearly as well. Limitations. It offers no consistent method of resolving conflicts, as I've already said. Um, it works plausibly when individuals are isolated, but it conflicts when interests overlap. And because communities are becoming increasingly interconnected, socially, politically, economically, um, egoism is less plausible than it once was. Again, in its psychological form, it's stated as a fact. People usually, especially in the weaker form, people usually will act in their own best interest, but not always. And it doesn't really work when you're trying to work with others. You've probably all heard of Ayn Rand. Uh, that just sounds wrong. I always want to say Ayn Rand, but I'm always corrected. No, no, it's Ayn Rand. It's kind of like Vincent van Gogh. The right way to pronounce that is Van Gogh, but who does? It's Vincent van Gogh, Ayn Rand. She was the most prominent modern universal ethical egoist. She lived from 1905 to 1982. She wrote many, many works. Probably the most famous is Atlas Shrugged. Movie's out now, a new version. See it. It's fantastic. But she called uh, ethical egoism rational ethical egoism. And her version argued that conflict simply wouldn't arise between individuals if they were rational. That theory does not address the very real conflicts that do actually arise in our crowded and interdependent societies. Plus, what is rational? Uh, who determines what is rational? Conflicts arise every day among people who consider themselves to be rational. Look back at World War II. Hitler kept demanding more and more territory of his neighbors. He considered himself rational. They considered him to be irrational. I think we would all agree that he wasn't, but you see what I'm saying. Who determines what's rational? Ayn Rand's theories are fascinating, but again, they don't stand up on their own. Now, as we progress through this class, you're going to see that none of these systems really stand up very well on their own. Generally, you're going to pick and choose. It's like a buffet. You're going to have a little utilitarianism, a little, when you make up your own personal philosophy, your own code of ethics. But um, these proponents actually believe that their systems would, for the most part, stand alone. I think it was Socrates who said that truth is the mean between the extremes. I'll have to check on that. It was either Socrates or Aristotle, but at any rate, truth is the mean between the extremes. And generally, uh, you're going to look right in the middle for the answer. And so you're going to choose a bit of each of these. They all make some sense, they all just don't stand alone. Utilitarianism. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. If I could figure out how to pause this stupid camera, I would get up and go put on my Spock wig and my Spock outfit. But you probably don't want to see that anyway. But utilitarianism maintains that everyone should perform that act or follow that moral rule which will bring about the greatest good or happiness for everyone concerned. It's fantastic because what you can do here, you can actually use a mathematical formula to determine how to act. X plus y equals, the greatest good for the greatest amount of people for the greatest time equals what you should do. Utilitarianism derives from the word utility or usefulness. Um, Utilitarians believe that morality is, or ought to be anyway, useful. The main proponents, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill. Bentham lived from 1748 to 1832. Mill, 1806 to 1873. These are, without a doubt, the most widely known and read utilitarians. Act. Now we're going to split it again. Two main forms, act and rule. Act utilitarianism, or AU, says perform that act that will bring about the most good for everyone involved or affected by the act. Now, act utilitarians believe that each situation is different. So each individual must try to bring about the greatest amount of good consequences for all involved in this situation at this time. Um, in other words, um, it's very situational. It's very relativistic. Um, Criticisms. It's difficult to determine the consequences for others. It's hard enough to determine the consequences for you. Then it gets really hard for others. And what may be a good consequence for you may not be equally or at all good for another. And how are you to tell unless you ask other people what would be good for them? Some more criticisms. It's impractical to have to begin anew for each situation and to have to decide what would be moral for that situation. You have to start from scratch with each situation. And then, is each act and each person completely and uniquely different? Probably not. An act utilitarian might argue that there are many similarities among people and their behaviors and this would justify laying down certain rules. Now, some more criticisms. We always want to be able to educate the young, and it's difficult to do this without having rules or guidelines to follow. Basically, you're saying do what you think is right when you think it's right. And that may work sometimes, but does it work all the time? Your only guide would be each person must assess what would be the greatest good consequences for each act and for each situation that arises. Now let's talk about rule utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism emerges out of criticisms of AU. According to AU, this will be effective because we have enough in common to justify setting up rules or to generate the greatest good. Excuse me, that's according to rule utilitarianism, not act. Some criticisms. Are any rules exceptionless? I mean, what we're saying is we can make rules because we have enough in common, and the bottom line here is that are there any rules that are exceptionless? It's difficult to determine, again, consequences for others. It would be difficult to be sure that a rule can be established to cover the diversity of human beings, which will truly and always bring about the greatest good for all. And then once again, same problem. It's difficult to educate the young because of the exceptions. We are just about done. I am just shooting through here as fast as possible. But CBA, cost benefit analysis. It creates problems for utilitarians because of the danger of trying to determine the social the social worth of individuals. Um, the greatest good is often interpreted as the greatest good for the minority, with possible immoral consequences to the minority. You know, it's just like we talk about the war on terror, and compared to, say, World War II, or compared to Korea or Vietnam, we have very few casualties. But what if it's your son or your niece or your nephew or your daughter that's killed? It makes no difference how few casualties they are because it affects you personally. And so that's how it works for the minority. It seems to work for the majority, but what about those few people? Um, Does even a good end justify any means used to attain it? Or should we also consider our means and our motives? Is the utility criterion understood as the greatest good for the greatest number? Is this always the right thing to strive for? And then, although utilitarianism, unlike egoism, tries to consider others, it runs into difficulties determining what would be good for others. Some difficulties with consequentialist theories in general. Can we discover all the consequences of our decisions in the present? This is especially difficult for utilitarians because they're concerned with the effects of their decisions on others. If you ever want to know about how we can determine consequences or results, try playing a game of solitaire. You make one mistake and you're stuck. You cannot move any further unless you cheat. If you cheat, you can change, the parameters of the game. But if you do cheat, you can say, well, if I had just made this move instead of, how do we determine the consequences? But the problem is that these theories demand that we discover and determine all the consequences of our actions or of our rules. Now we're going to talk a little bit about care ethics. Carol Gilligan's work. She is still alive, born in 1936. This is a reaction to Kohlberg's works, and we've talked about that in the last lecture. She posits that men and women are different. Imagine that. When it comes to making ethical decisions. Sometimes they call these feminist ethics, which I question. Why are they called feminist? Hated Gilligan's work. They still hate it. She says there are fundamental differences between men and women. Men's moral attitudes have more to do with justice and rights and competition, being independent, living by the rules, whereas Gilligan posits that women's moral attitudes have to do with generosity and harmony and reconciliation and working to maintain close relationships. She's not saying that it's exclusively women that do this, but primarily, and her work was done with observation. She raises female values over male values. At least that's what the critics say. They also say it replaces one unfair system with another. The theory seems to prescribe more traditional gender roles to men and women. Is it a woman's nature to be caring? Critics say that this theory could be divisive both socially and politically. And I say, well, my goodness, do we throw away evidence simply because it's not politically correct? Generally, in our society, we do. We don't look at something that may be factual if it's not politically correct. And Gilligan's work raised a lot of questions. Well, that's all that we have to talk about for Chapter 2. I'll be getting Chapter 3 lecture up fairly quickly. Have a tremendous day.